Today, we are going to talk about mixing drums inside of Cubase. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I go by the name of Keith Keys, and in this video, what we are going to do is we are going to talk about mixing gospel drums, and we're going to talk about it inside of Cubase. And before we get started, if you would, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell if you would like to see more videos like this. So I have my session pulled up, and I want to go through a couple of things that I'm doing inside of this session to enhance the drums, to make the drums stand out, and to show you exactly what I did in this session so that you could apply this to your own session. Now, some of the techniques that I'm using, some of the plugins that I'm using, you may not have. I'll try to leave a link in the description below to the plugins that I am using, but I'll try to explain the methodology behind it so that you can apply this to whatever songs that you are currently working on. So let me just play a little bit of this session, a little bit of the instrumental of this session. I played two parts of it. The beginning of this song kind of switches to the end of the song. So I'll play both parts so that you can kind of hear what's going on. Then we'll listen to it with no plugins, nothing, no processing going on. And then we can kind of go through and see exactly what I did to achieve the sound that I have. So this is a little bit of the project beforehand. And this is how the beginning of it sounds a little bit. Cool, now we'll jump to the end because the song switches up dramatically. This is kind of how the ending goes. Cool. So that's a little bit of the song. You can tell that the beginning of the song is a way different vibe than the end of the song. The end of the song more so is a shouting beat, praise break type of beat going on. So let's listen to just the drums, and we'll just choose the ending. Let's listen to just the drums with the plugins on. I'll take all the plugins off, and let's hear the difference. So this is with. So you can hear there's a dramatic difference between before and after with these drums in particular. So let's go down the line and let's kind of go through some of the things that I did. Now, this drum section, this percussion section is mixed with the live drums from my drummer. Also mixed with some samples that I also have to make the drums feel more fuller, more fatter, more bigger, and to really sit in the mix better. And then also we have a lot of other percussive instruments and elements in here just to kind of give the drums some more life. So we are going to go through some of that right now. So the very first thing that we have is the kick, and this is the kick actually from the live drum kit. This is how that sounds. So cool, that's the kick, and this is what is it without the plugins. So one thing about the kick, if you get kicks from recorded drum sets, a lot of them sometimes, depending on how the kick drum is mic'd up, will give you a lot of attack on the beater. Sometimes it won't give you a lot of attack on the beater. Sometimes it will give you a lot of the sub bass information that you need inside a kick drum to actually solidify as a kick drum with a low tone. And sometimes you don't get that. So the first thing I did is I have pulled up here the SSL G channel. This is the mono because we're dealing with just a kick drum from Waves. And like I said, I'll leave the links to all the plugins that I'm using in the description below so you can try this for yourself. And the first thing I actually did on here was I actually used the kick preset on here. It's the kick drum preset. So this first one's called the kick drum preset. It actually gives you a lot of a good starting point, a good foundation. So we'll just click it again. And this is what it sounds like if you just click just the preset. Cool, and which sounds like a kick drum. The only thing about this that I do change, especially now, this also depends on how the kick drum is mic'd. But if I listen to this kick drum, I don't hear a lot of sub information, a lot of the actual low frequencies of the kick drum. I hear a lot of the beater. So what I like to do is I like to change the low frequencies on this plugin to actually give us that sub information. So let's do that. So let's... You see, as we roll it up, you get more of the beater. And as we come down, right around here, right around 50 hertz. So without, with. And if we look at the rest of this plugin, we can see that the compressor is at a ratio of 5:1, 5.4:1. The release time isn't super fast. You want to have it held just a little bit. The threshold is just below 0 dB, so it's really attacking the kick drum at its highest point. The gate is doing a lot of the work because there is a lot of bleed with this kick drum from the rest of the drum kit. So that is what we did. That's what I did on this kick drum. So let's go to the next track, and it is the kick sample track that I have in this session. So let's just hear what it's doing. Cool. And what I did with this kick sample is I just chose a sample out of my sample library that had a lot of low-end information from a kick drum, and I paired it with the actual kick drum to give me that full low sound of a kick drum. So this is what both of them sound like. And let me show you what I'm doing to the sample. So I'm doing a couple things. So first of all, I am boosting super heavy with this EQ. This is the F6 RTA EQ from Waves. Once again, link in the description. And all I'm doing is boosting a crazy amount, just about 10 dB of 64 hertz. So here we go. This is what it sounds like without it. Just a sample. This is with. So this is generally the frequency that the sample's already living at. I just accentuated it more. The next thing that I have going on after that is the R bass plugin from Wave. So this is actually used for a lot of bass instruments, just bass instruments, which is what it is like a compressor as well for bass. But I used it on the sample for the kick drum just to give it more consistency. And that's another tip for if you're ever using samples along with your drums to make your drums sound a lot fuller, even though your drums might have different velocities based on how the drummer is hitting it. If the sample is set at one velocity all the way through, that kind of gives a way more consistent sound of a drum set. So this is kind of what this R bass is helping out with. And this is all it's doing. So this is without. This is with. So what it's doing is keeping the frequencies of all the low end information consistent along with the hits of the kick drum. So this is what the kick drum sounds like, both tracks together. Nice and full. I have the kick drums actually going to what I call the kick bus, right? So I have both the kick drums tracks being processed separately, and then both of these tracks are going to this kick bus track. And in this kick bus track, the only thing I'm doing is adding saturation. The plugin of choice that I'm using for the saturation is the Tape Mellowify plugin from Arturia. And if you don't know what saturation does, it gives harmonics to a certain frequency or all frequencies. So instead of the frequency happening at one point, harmonics then come into where that same signal is taking place in other frequencies. So this is what the kick bus is sounding like. So this is what the kick drums are sounding like without. With. You can hear how saturation will bring this to life. Now, there's a million saturation plugins. Find the one that works best for you. I'm using the Fat Analog preset, but then with this Arturia plugin, you really want to adjust the settings because this saturator does get crazy on you and a lot of the drive, and it does well with giving a lot of like artifacts to it. It tries to emulate really old tape saturation, so it gives flutter, wear, and mechanics of the actual tape machine, and sometimes you just don't want all that. So just remember to adjust your settings afterwards. So that's the kick drum. So let's move on to the snare drums now. Now, all of these tracks right here are my snares, and they're actually all going to this channel right here called the snare bus. And the reason to why we bus things like this is so that we can have control over the instruments as one instrument as a whole, rather than all of them just separately. Even though we will process each track separately in different ways, we will want to control everything together as one instrument altogether. So that's why all the snares go down to this snare bus. So let's go through what I have going on. The first track that I do have is the snare top track. So this is just what that sounds like. Cool. So the first thing I have is a gate, and I have the gate set at negative 36.2 dB, just to eliminate a lot of the bleed from the rest of the drum set that's going on, just so I can attack the snare the way I want to. The next plugin I have on this track is the RTA stereo plugin, the EQ, and I'm just bumping literally like 1 dB at 404 hertz, just around that area on this snare. And the next thing that I have on the snare track is the H-Comp plugin by Waves. And once again, I don't have the attack super fast. One thing with drums, if you have the attack so fast, especially on like a snare drum, you will take away the transients of the actual snare. The snare actually won't punch as hard. I do have the punch setting boosted up to about 24. It's fully mixed, and this is kind of what that sounds like with the compressor. This is what it sounds like without the compressor. You can tell how this compressor really makes the snare drum sit more in the front. So that's all for this track. So now this next track I call snare trigger, and which I have the Slate Digital trigger 2 actually going on this track. And all this plugin does is it takes whatever track you have and whatever transients that it can detect it picking up, it would then insert samples over it or in place of that particular track. So it's the same exact track as my regular snare top track, right? But But what the Slate Trigger 2 plugin is doing, every time it detects these transients, it's inserting these two samples that I have. The first sample I have is this snare 1, and the second one is this black snare. And the reason why I have these two samples on here is only because it gives ambience, or it gives reverb, it gives room. So this particular track isn't meant to give the snare drum a lot of punch, but to give the snare drum a lot of depth with reverb or different samples. So that's just another way. Instead of just adding reverb to your snare drums, you can just use samples to complement the snare drum that you actually have. So this is what this sounds like in solo. Almost sounds like a little trash can. That's what we have there. So let's play that with the snare top together. This is what we have. Cool. And if you hear, now we have the transients from the actual snare top and the ambience from the snare trigger track. So the next track that we have is the snare bottom track, and this is the actual snare bottom track from the drum kit. This drum kit was mic'd on the top and on the bottom, and this is kind of what we have going on. This is what you hear. And what we have on this track is we have a gate. It's the same exact settings that we had on the snare top, just drug over. Even though it's set this high, I didn't want to set it too much higher to risking any transients. Even though you did hear some bleed. In the context of the whole mix, especially when you have overhead mics implemented in, you kind of don't hear it. But what you want to do is to remove those hits, those bleeds, and you just want to fade in and out. Just make sure you get no artifacts, and then you're good. Actually, to be honest with you, there you go. You want to make sure you just have to hit. You don't want to make the cuts too close to a snare drum, because if it does have any ambience after the snare, after the stick hits the snare, you don't want to cut that off. So, and next what we have going on is the compressor, which again is the H-Comp compressor. In its similar settings as which I had the snare top, although I do like to compress this a little bit more, so the threshold is a little bit lower. When it comes to snare bottoms, this track really doesn't have a lot of it, but if you are mixing drums and you have a lot of ghost notes on a snare drum, that's not the actual main hit, but just ghost notes. A good way to get those ghost notes to stand out in the mix is to overly compress the snare bottom, because the snare bottom isn't there for necessarily transients, but it's there for tone. And it brings the snares, the actual snares that lay on the bottom of the snare drum, it brings those more up in the mix. The only thing you want to be careful about is when you do that, if there is bleed, you do risk a lot of the other bleed from like the cymbals, for example, to be so prevalent in the mix. So you just want to be careful of that. But this is what it sounds like with this compressor on, just on the snare bottom. Cool. Without. With. Cool. So now let's play that with the other snare drums together, and let's listen to how that sounds. Cool. So now as we hear, the snare drum sounds big, it sounds punchy, it sounds deep, it has width, it has depth, and it has attack. So that's what we want. So the next snare drum I have, and I actually still could have used a trigger for this, but I just chose not to for this. But this one I call Construction Snare. That's just the name of the snare drum and the sample that I have. But this is just another sample that I implemented in here. And this sample specifically has no plugins going on it. But this is what the sample sounds like just by itself. Cool. And if you listen, you can hear how deep that is. And this is the reason to why I picked the snare drum. So in the context of the overall mix, without that snare drum, the snare sounded kind of weak, and it kind of didn't sound as fat as I wanted it to sound. So that's why I implemented that. So let's actually play that in context of the mix without, and I'll add that construction snare in, and you can see how it sounds. So this is without. With. Without. With. It just gives a lot more weight to the snare drum. So that's what I did there. So now we went through the kicks, we went through the snares. Now let's go to the toms. And for the tom section, I'm actually going to go to the beginning portion of the song, because the beginning portion is mainly just toms almost. So let's go there. So this is what it sounds like in context of the mix. So the next thing we have is the SSL channel G strip. You can go to a tom setting to really give you a good starting point. But the one thing that you do want to do is, I call it like a wonky sound when it comes to toms. When you hit a tom, if you were to take a parametric EQ, just like the stock one in Cubase, for example, and you were to just sweep across the frequencies, you'll notice how there's a frequency that doesn't belong, in other words. And most times, not all times, but sometimes, depending on how it's mic'd. But basically, it's like a hollowness of the tom. You want to take some of that out. You don't want to take a lot of it out. But that wonkiness for me was just under 800 kilohertz. So that's where it was for me. You can just do sweeps to find it. Each tom is different, so each tom usually won't have the same exact frequency. That's being a resonant problem. And then I also have a little bit of low end, around 100 boosted, just to give me some oomph. So this is kind of what that sounds like. So this is what that sounds like. Cool. And I do have a gate on here, and I do have the gate active on this channel strip as well, even though I still have a gate beforehand. Both of them are just kind of doing the same job. It's just like a redundancy, but that's why I have it. You only need one gate, but I have two. So the next item is the tom 2, which that's what this one sounds like. Very similar, a gate in the SSL. Very similar settings. However, you can see a lot of the low end information is being changed because we're dealing with a different tom. So I just have 70 hertz being boosted some more, just to give me some more body. I have like 8K being boosted for more clarity. The compressor I do have set a little bit higher for the lower toms, and as we go to the lower toms, you see this compressor change a lot. But it depends on what tom you're actually using. The only thing you don't want to do is kill the actual transient of your tom. And then also I have the rock toms, which basically is just like tom number 3. And if you can tell by these waveforms, the tom number 3 is doing a lot of the driving and is the main force of the beginning of the song. So this is what that sounds like. Cool. Same thing with the other toms. So This is very similar to tom number 2 setting. I do have some more of the high end boosted just to give me some more clarity. My filter now is almost dropped totally completely out of the picture. It's a low tom, so we need the low end information more than anything. The compressor I do have set about 7 to 1, not 8 to 1 like tom number 2, just to not kill those transients. And the other thing to mention with toms is, in my drums, is I mix in drummer's perspective. If you don't know what drummer's perspective is when a drummer sits at a drum set, what does he see and where does he see it? He sees a hi-hat on the left, traditionally, a snare drum right in front of him, kind of to the left, tom 1 to the left, like a little bit off to his left, tom 2 a little bit off to his right, traditionally. Now it depends on what drum kit you're using and how many toms there are, because you can line up a drum set with so many toms, but usually in drummer's perspective, this is what we mean. Hi-hat to the left, you have your left and your right overheads panned in the perspective places, but the toms, however, are outlining, right in front of the drummer, and then whatever toms, extra lower toms you have, 3, 4, 5 even sometimes, to the right side. So with our panning, you can kind of see that. So I have tom 1 panned to the left by 52, tom right panned to the right by 50, tom 2 panned to the right by 55, and I do have my rock toms all the way to the right, sitting on the floor all the way to the right. So that's drummer's perspective. That's how I have the toms. So now let's move over to the hi-hat real quick. So with this hi-hat, once again, if you can't tell, I'm using a lot of this SSLG channel. It is a great tool to use because it gives you all-in-one functionality when it comes to drums. So this is what I have here. I don't have basically any information in the low end happening, barely any information in the low end happening. But when it comes up to the high end, I do have just a little bit of this 4.5K dipped just a little bit harsh around there, and then I have a lot of 16K compressor set at 8 to 1, and we've been over this G channel strip so many times that I kind of don't have to go over that again. So now on the overheads, barely anything at all, but I do have the overheads going through it just to keep consistency with the rest of the drum set. A lot of the processing that I do along with my overheads and the overall sound of my drums actually happens on my overall drum bus. But the next channel we have is the room track. I'm literally doing nothing to the room. This is what that sounds like. Very mono, right up the middle, not doing much with it. So I have the hi-hat, the overheads in the room mic going to this overhead bus. And with this overhead bus, this is what this sounds like. So cool. With the overheads, the one thing you want to be aware of is that when you're mixing your drums, you want to do it in the context of the mix. You don't want to do too many things in solo. You might think you're messing with a snare drum or a tom, and honestly, it's the overhead that's giving you that information. So you want to kind of mix in the context of the whole drum kit and not just mix solo when it comes to the drums. But for the overheads, what I have is the CLA drum plugin. CLA drums, and I have it on the overhead setting. This bass really isn't doing anything at all. I have the treble set on roof, boosted a whole lot, so it's giving a lot of high-end brightness. The compressor, I have it on, but I don't have it doing a lot. I have the reverb on studio. I have the gate off. You don't want to have a gate on overheads. Just note that. So this is what it sounds like with it on. This is what it sounds like without. Without. With. just brings it to life. So this is a very good utility to have. It gives you your EQ and bass and treble. It gives you compression. It gives you reverb. It gives you a gate. So it's just like a channel strip, just like the SSLG channel was as well. The other thing that I do have going on here is that I have a de-esser. This is just the stock de-esser from Cubase. I did notice how a lot of harshness was coming through with the cymbals. So a good trick is to just use a de-esser. I have it deducted at 0.3, so it's not even deducting a whole dB, but it makes a dramatic difference. So I'll play it without, and then I'll add it in, and you can hear what I'm saying. All right, with. So it takes that harshness right off the hit of the cymbals, but it still allows for you to hear the cymbals in full and not necessarily taking away of the integrity of the actual cymbals. So this is what the drum section sounds with everything that we kind of went through so far, minus these few things. Cool. So the next thing that I do have is we'll go over here to this. We'll go over here, and I have these claps going on. It's just a simple clap. This is what it sounds like. I just have this fresh air plugin. So this is a Slate digital plugin. All of this is giving a lot of bright and top end freshness to this clap, so it stands out in the mix. This is with, this is without. Cool. And I also have these claps being sent to a drum reverb channel, which I'll get to in a second. But that's it for the claps. The next thing I do have is the sample. This is what samples sound like. Just a nice little percussive sample. I like to find samples a lot and just use them in odd places. And the one thing I'm doing here is I'm giving like this is just a stock EQ for Cubase. I'm giving like the telephone effect where it's really boosted around 2K to 3K and everything else is kind of just filtered out. So it's just giving that effect. So this is what it sounds like without. Sounds good by itself, but to sit in the mix, didn't need the kick drum, didn't need all that high end. I just needed some frequencies just to give the percussion instruments and the percussion section some movement. And the last thing I have is a tambourine. This is an alternative tambourine loop that I just warped it to this BPM. So this is what it is. Cool. So that is all of this. So now I do have this channel called the P Drum Comp. This is the parallel drum compression that I use. So if you don't know what parallel drum compression is, all it is taking the exact signal that's going from the drum bus, which all of these buses, all of these channels, you know, all the kicks go to the kick bus, all the snares go to the snare bus, the toms go to the tom bus, the hi-hats and the overheads go to the overhead bus, but then all of these buses go to the overall drum bus. Okay, so the overall drum bus is here. We will get to the overall drum bus. What I want to show you next is the parallel drum compression. And on this parallel drum compression track, what I'm doing is I'm boosting low end shelf and a high end shelf into this Magneto 2, which is a stock saturation plugin from Cubase, and I am saturating everything, almost every single thing, saturating everything on this parallel drum compression. And I have the SSL G master bus plugin on the parallel drum compression. So what parallel drum compression is, it's taking the signals, whatever signals you send to it, it's taking that, and you can overly compress that to give a consistent in that tone or in those dynamics. Now, with drums, if you overly compress stuff, you take away the transients of it. But what we want is the consistent of frequencies from certain elements that we send to it to be prevalent amongst the whole drum section. So what I have actually going to this parallel drums are, I have the kick sample, I have the kick bus, I have the bottom snare I have the snare bus, I have the tom bus, and I have the overhead bus. Now, each of these buses are being sent to the parallel drum compression at different gains, at different signals. Snare drums and kick drums almost always will be sent 0 because, especially in gospel music, that's the foundation of it. And the percussive section is the foundation of the song. So you need that to be the most consistent. So the game with parallel compression is consistency. So that's what I have going to the parallel drum compression bus. And if I were to hit play, so if you can see, we're getting 8 to 12 dB of gain reduction, and the attack is super fast. So with regular so like I said, with parallel drum compression, we're not worried about the transients necessarily. We're worried about the overall consistency of the sound. So we have the attack set very fast, the release set semi-fast, but the ratio's 10 to 1. So it's compressing a very lot, and like I said, we're getting 8 to 12 dB of gain reduction. So this is what the drums sound like with the parallel drum compression, and then I'll cut it off in the middle and you can hear the difference. Without, with. So it just gives a lot of density to this. And if you have a very dense track, like this one is, I think, what's the number? 60 tracks so far. The drums and certain elements can get lost. So parallel compression is a great technique to that. So now the overall drum bus, I just have the fresh air plug-in once again. This is just giving a brightness to the drums. So I'll play it with. This is without. With. Cool. And the next thing I have is the SSL G Master Bus Compressor again. But on the drum bus channel, this is the Master Drum Bus channel. This is the drums. This is the instrument, the drums as an instrument. So when you're dealing with the drums as an instrument, we don't want to kill the transients or else they're just not drums anymore, right? So we have the attack set very slow. The release still set semi-fast, but the ratio is only set 4 to 1. So we're not getting that much gain reduction. And a lot of the gain reduction is the kick drum. So if we were to mute the kick, you can tell how the needle is moving, but it's not moving so consistently near 8 dB. And when you're dealing with compression with the drums, remember that a microphone that's set on a specific instrument of the drum set, meaning the snare drum or specific tom, whatever you do compress, you're compressing any other sound that may be in that microphone as well. So that's why it's very important to make these decisions in the context of the mix, because you might be boosting a little bit on the snare drum, but really you're boosting the cymbals as well. So even when it comes to parallel compression, when it comes to sending things to parallel compression, you want to do less than more. So don't send everything to parallel compression. And if it is like the live drum of it, you want to be cognizant that you're sending everything that was picked up in that drum's microphone to be compressed as well, meaning the overall drum sound will be even higher. So the last thing that I do have is this drum verb channel. And what I do have is the Valhalla Vintage Verb. I love Valhalla. And on here, I have the large wood room setting. And you just want to play around with the decay time. You want to also play around with the EQ. With drums, it's not, you don't want a lot of low end to actually be introduced inside your drum kit, inside reverb. So you want to roll that off. So I have mine rolled off at 380 hertz. And I have some high end rolled off as well. And this is just what the verb channel sounds like. All I have going to this channel actually is the claps. So this is without. So the only thing I actually have going to this channel is the claps. So this is the claps. And then without. So usually I would use different reverbs, like on the snare drums, but each song is different. That's why this just isn't a how-to one size fits all. Each song is different, each song is different, and it's, especially if you're using samples that have a lot of ambience, then you don't want to just overdo your drum set with a lot of reverb. So one last time. So here's how the drums sound in the mix overall. Everything we went through. Cool, so that's how we mix these gospel drums in this track in Cubase. I hope that you were able to find some valuable information from this. Like I said, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. This isn't just how to mix drums and then you can just go on and just mix every drum set the same way. But there's certain things that you just want to be aware of when you're mixing drums. So I do hope that some of this information can help you out on the next session that you're working on. So before you leave, if you could hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bells for more videos like this, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.